I'm really invested in the mystery, and I'm really invested in the investigation, and I want to feel like we're doing something active, especially like if there's some way we can help family members who are really struggling and who need that support. But it is really ultimately about trying to better understand the lives that Indigenous people live, and that there's, communities like Sweetwater on the Navajo Nation where an elder can go missing in the middle of the night and never be seen again. I think is just so heartbreaking, and that people don't know that that's happening. People don't understand, like, the circumstances that they have to live in.
Connie Walker is a Pulitzer Prize winner, a Peabody winner, a trailblazing journalist, and, best of all, a friend. She's currently on the cover of The Walrus magazine, and, incredibly, she was named one of Time magazine's 100 People of the Year. In her new podcast, Stolen: Trouble in Sweetwater, Connie explores a crisis of policing in an Indigenous community. She investigates the disappearance of 2 women on the Navajo Nation, a place where people tell Connie that you can get away with murder. To her surprise, Connie discovers a link between the 2 cases, a link that poses troubling questions about the nature of justice on the reservation. Connie, thank you for joining us on Crime Story.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So let's start with the 2 women that you are investigating, or maybe let's just start with the one that you start with, and then how that leads you to the next one.
Yeah. Well, Ella Mae Begay is a Diné elder who was born and raised on the Navajo Nation. She was somebody who, her family told us, like, basically never left home. Like, she maybe took one trip to St. Louis when she was at an Indian boarding school as a child, but her son lived in Denver, and she'd never been to Denver to, even visit. She was definitely a homebody. She was known to be, or is known to be, like a master rug weaver. So she has this tradition of rug weaving in her family. And when I heard about Ella Mae, or when I saw her photo, I feel like that was the thing that really initially grabbed me, because I felt like, she looked like so many people in my own family. And the fact that she was missing and the circumstances around her disappearance really were kind of shocking to me, that she lived alone at home in her community, and that she just disappeared and vanished one night, and that she's never been seen again. And when I heard the story of what happened that night, I also was just it just raised so many questions for me about, obviously, what happened to Ella Mae and where is she and why can't her family find her? But all of the troubling things about what it meant to live as an elder in this community. And the story that we initially heard was that, her daughter was home alone, and they lived right next door to one another. And someone broke into her house.
The daughter's house.
The daughter's house. And she was, hiding in her room while someone was rummaging through her cupboards, taking things to drink. And then she was terrified. And then she heard this person who kicked in her door, leave. And she saw him, walking away, but also in the direction of her mom's house. And she called the police to report this intruder. And I could imagine that, right? If you have that fear, and then you feel like, oh, it must be relief when you can finally dial 911 and call for help. And the police answered, the dispatch answered the call, but the police never responded. They didn't come and help. And then she noticed that her mom's truck started up, and she thought that was so odd, because why would her mom be leaving home in the middle of the night? And she tried calling her and texting her and didn't get any response. And then she saw the truck leave, and she called police again, and this time they finally arrived, but it was too late.
And it's important to sort of place us in the Navajo Nation as well. So can you tell us sort of where it is, and it's quite rural where they're living, right? So they're not, they can't just run to a neighbor's as well. So just give us a sense of where the homes are and what it kind of looks like.
Well, the Navajo Nation is huge. It's the biggest reservation in the United States. It's 27,000 square miles. I don't really know actually what that is. But it's giant. It takes,
you didn't go from one end to the other, basically.
Well, we basically, we did to travel around it, but it took hours. It would take a day to travel through. And also just the landscape. It's this desert landscape with mountainous areas, but then also just complete desert and red rock everywhere. It's so beautiful. Like, it is gorgeous, like beautiful. But when we went to Ella May's house, we were so surprised because we got lost. There are no road markers anywhere. There's actually, like, you get to one point where you're like on a paved road and then it just ends. And then from there, and then on, you're basically on a road, and I'm using air quotes, but it's like you can't go like more than like 15, 20 kilometers an hour on these roads. Like, it's so rough. It's a very rough road, and it's so remote. Like, there's not a store around. There's no street lights. There are no house numbers or street names. And so, I think that's part of the issue. Like, immediately you're like, oh, things are different here for sure. Even when you call the police and they do show up, like, it can take, they're only 45 minutes away to the nearest town of Shiprock where the police are. But it can take a lot longer for them to arrive, just because it's so hard to find people and they don't have, addresses in the way that we do. But also the road conditions, like, you actually can't go very fast.
So the police do finally show up. Mm-hmm. Ella May's missing. What do the police initially think happened? Where does the investigation start?
Well, it didn't start then. I think that there was, so much of this is like us piecing things together, obviously, after the fact, and hearing from different family members who entered, the story at different points. But essentially, I think that initially police didn't really understand that Ella May was missing. They just noticed that her truck was gone and she was gone, but they didn't necessarily think that she was missing right away. It wasn't until the next day, when her family was still trying to get a hold of her and piecing things together themselves, that they realized, oh, something's really wrong here. And that's when I think the search for Ella May began. And what was so remarkable about Ella May is that almost as soon as we went out to this community and started meeting people and talking to people, you realized very, very quickly that there's, this is one case, but there's actually a crisis of missing people in this community. Like, there are so many people who have gone missing or who have been killed. And that everyone you talk to talks about the police response, or the lack of a police response, essentially. That, police never helped look, never helped search for my loved one. Like, don't call me back. I don't know what's happening with their investigation. And immediately we kind of realized Ella May's case was different, that she actually, despite the fact that it took them a while to show up initially and they didn't immediately understand she was missing, once they did, like, the police response was bigger than any other missing persons case in the Navajo Nation and also in the Shiprock district, which is what we focused on.
Why? Do you understand why?
I think that, I think partly it's because of the fact of who she was, this elder in her community. But also I think her family, once they realized and mobilized, became really, really vocal advocates for her. And, it's kind of extraordinary. Like, I think I'm like, that's not unfamiliar. If you've listened to my podcast, like, how important it is that the family's advocacy is really makes or break whether or not they get attention, whether they get resources. But Ella May's family, like her niece Seraphine, really like kind of just took up this megaphone for her aunt and did all of these extraordinary things, including, I think, something that was maybe unusual in this community at the time is like she was just vocal and she was critical of police and critical of Navajo Nation leadership, and she wasn't afraid of doing that. And I think that she really kind of galvanized a lot of attention and support around her aunt. And so it kind of, it's resulted in Ella May being one of the, I think, most high-profile cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the United States, which is remarkable given, where she came from. And, Ella May lived in her home without running water or electricity. She had just gotten solar panels the year before, and so she just had electricity, in the few months before she went missing. But, she lived this very, very quiet life that a lot of people don't understand. Many people in the Navajo Nation are still living like that.
And it was her niece, Seraphine. Mm-hmm. She even walked all the way to D.C. Mm-hmm. I mean, the woman has stamina and real strength of character. It was really, honestly, that was kind of when we first were introduced to Seraphine, when she was on this walk. That was when we first talked to her. And it was like an exhausting
exhausting walk, but she felt like, I have to be doing something. I can't, like, we've searched everywhere. We're like waiting for some like development in this investigation. And she was just so frustrated and really wanted to channel that. What she said actually was that, not long after Ella May went missing, Gabby Petito went missing in the U.S. I don't know if you remember her case, but like she said it felt like the whole country, rallied around and, tried to find Gabby Petito. And she was like, oh, this is possible. This should happen for my aunt. Like, how do I mobilize this kind of support from my Auntie Ella May? And that's why she started walking. She was like, if people hear about her, they'll care too. And that's why she decided to eventually, like, I think her initial walks were like to the capital of the Navajo Nation and in and around Sweetwater where her aunt lived. But eventually she was like, that's not enough. And she walked from Sweetwater, Arizona, all the way to Washington, D.C., and she met with Secretary Haaland, the first Native American cabinet member of the United States, and somebody who's been an advocate for this crisis of violence in Indigenous communities. And I think that, without that kind of family advocacy, like, I feel like that was such a huge part of having Ella May's story get the attention that it did. But when we went there, then what became clear was that, like, there were so many other families that weren't getting that attention, that never got, a fraction of the attention or resources that Ella May got. And that was then, just raised so many other questions for us around policing and around the rates of violence in this really kind of small, remote community.
And so that's what brings you to the second case that you guys start to look into. And her name is Christina Carrillo. Tell me about her.
Well, what happened was that I feel like Ella May's case really led us to the police first, because we had heard so much criticism of the Navajo police. And they're actually kind of, the Navajo police is one of the largest and one of the longest running tribal police forces in North America. And I know that there's recently, actually, I think it was the tribal police in Ontario traveled to the Navajo Nation to like learn from them and to try to improve their community policing. Their own community policing as using the Navajo Nation as an example. So I think that they have kind of a proud reputation in some respects, but what we were hearing from people in the community was just so much criticism of the police. And it really, made me wonder, what is it like to police here? What's going on? Why do you call them and they don't show up? What is happening? And so we did a ride along with the Navajo police officer, and that was enlightening and eye opening, and really just kind of made me realize this is bigger than one missing person's case. It's obviously we were committed to wanting to try to find out what happened to Ella May, but it put it in context almost immediately that, okay, there's so much else here, because every call every officer goes on is like a window into another world and another issue and something else that's happening in this community that is as urgent and as critical to know and understand as the missing persons crisis. And spending time with the police and getting permission to kind of embed with them and spend a lot of time with officers at the station and in dispatch was really enlightening. And that's what led us to Christina's case, because at one point when we were hanging out at the police station, there was an officer, Sergeant Foster, and I was just asking him about missing people in the Shiprock district, because we focused on this one district on the Navajo Nation because it's so huge and we felt like that was the most manageable. And he mentioned that there were two important cases in the Shiprock district. One was Ella May's, and another one was another Indigenous woman named Ronelle Rose Bennett, who went missing actually the same day as Ella May, and just about an hour apart. It's kind of wild. But there's like a kind of shelf of binders of all of the missing people in the Shiprock district, and it made me wonder, what makes one case more important than another here? Why are police prioritizing certain cases over others? And that's what really led us to Christina's case. We didn't find a single news article about Christina Carrillo there was very little information available until we started talking to people about her disappearance. There was one Facebook post that we saw from her sister that was pleading for help, that she and her family had heard really disturbing news about Christina and were going to report her missing. And very quickly we realized that there was very little police involvement in the investigation into her disappearance. And that her case was just being treated completely differently than LMA's. So it made us, want to ask those questions about why. And that's how we started looking into Christina's disappearance.
Why do you think, and what did you learn about why maybe her case, like you mentioned that LMA, maybe she was older than the general people who tend to go missing and murder, or at least missing. They tend to be younger people. But what else? Why do you think that she got no attention? I mean, it really is stark, the difference.
Well, I think that, LMA was this kind of cherished elder, and I think that it can be really easy to empathize with that. You're like, oh, I have a grandmother, I have a cookum, I have people in my family and community, and the terror that you feel that something like that could happen to them. And I think with Christina, it's not at all that there are things about her that you obviously that you can empathize with as well. But I think that it really, I think it speaks to what what kinds of cases get attention. I think it really does have to do with who people can identify with and who people can empathize with. And I think it has a lot to do with some of the kind of victim blaming that goes along with missing people sometimes. And so Christina, she lived a really hard life, from the time she was a kid. She had a lot of violence in her life, a lot of abuse. And as an adult, she struggled with addictions, and she used drugs. She sometimes sold drugs. And she was known to police when her sister reported her missing. The officer was like, oh, Cheesy? He knew her nickname. He had multiple interactions with her in his job. And so I feel what it reminded me of and what we talk about in the podcast was what happened in Vancouver on the downtown east side, and how so many women went missing because police, because the public, because nobody took it seriously, that so many women who struggled in addiction and in poverty, who were most of them Indigenous or many of them Indigenous.
You could brush it away because of what, quote unquote, lifestyle, right?
Exactly.
That they could have just wandered away, that they're just sort of unreliable.
Yeah. And that's what her sister was told initially when she reported her missing. We'll just have to hope she shows up, And I think what also didn't help Christina's case in terms of the investigation was the fact that she wasn't reported missing until months after she was last seen. Her sister, what happened actually was that Christina's uncle was at the casino, and somebody came up to him and said, why aren't you looking for Christina? Why aren't you looking for Cheesy? We're hearing terrible things. Something really bad happened to her. And that was the first time, some people in her family understood that something was wrong. And her sister Denise doesn't live right there in the community. She lives a couple of hours away. She has young kids. She has a lot going on. And so when she finally heard that, she went to report her missing. But when we started looking into Christina's case, no one knew when she was last seen, or where she was last seen.
Even the police?
The police didn't know any of that. They thought maybe that she lived in this area of Shiprock called Farm Road, that she had been seen on Farm Road. But we saw missing persons posters that placed her being last seen at a casino in June, and she was reported missing in September. We were able to kind of pinpoint a little bit more about when she actually was last seen, but there was still it's so hard to kind of get any concrete answers or information when it's that long. Everyone talks about the first 24 hours or 48 hours being the most important, and that was just gone.
What did you in your investigation, sort of as best you can, kind of figure out what happened to her or her last hours or whatever? Where was she? What happened?
Well, very early on we heard about, one of the last nights that she was seen, the last night that we think she was seen, she lived in with a man named Melvin Lee in Shiprock, and they were like roommates more than they're not related, not in a relationship. And people who were there at that house that evening said that, Christina got upset about something, was in an argument, and we've heard different variations of this with either Melvin or her mother, who also stayed there, and that she walked off, and that was the last time she was seen. And I think that, it was so much about absolutely trying to piece together when was she last seen and what happened to her, and is there any truth to these terrible, terrible rumors, really violent rumors that her family was hearing about her. But it was also about trying to, like, as you said before, like understand what led to that point, really try, because I feel like that's the black and white question, right? Is like, what happened to Ella May? What happened to Christina? And then as you get deeper into like the circumstances of when they were last seen and what happened that night and what is maybe the specific violent incident that led to their death or disappearance, you also get all of this other information about their lives and about what was happening in the weeks leading up, what was happening in the months and the years. And I think that is honestly like that kind of gray area and what it says, not just about someone's like someone's death or disappearance, but what it says about someone's life and what it says about the lives of people who live in this community. And the rates of violence there is really kind of the most shocking and revelatory things I think that we were able to uncover. And I think that's really the goal of all of our podcasts, honestly. I think that I'm really invested in the mystery and I'm really invested in the investigation, and I want to feel like we're doing something active, especially like if there's some way we can help family members who are really struggling and who, need that support. But it is really ultimately about trying to better understand the lives that Indigenous people live, and that there's, communities like Sweetwater on the Navajo Nation where, an elder can go missing in the middle of the night, or Christina Carrillo can just never be seen again. I think is just so heartbreaking, and that people don't know that that's happening. People don't understand, like, the circumstances that they have to live in.
That, and I think what it does is, like you were saying, that every, Ella May, you could sort of see your grandmother in her. And you don't have to be Indigenous to see an elderly lady and be like, oh, that shouldn't have happened. But what the work does is it humanizes even Christina. So, like, she becomes an actual three-dimensional human. Then you're like, oh, there are similarities. We're all human. Yeah. This young girl came up from such difficult times, and you do get into her talking to people about wanting to change her life, and how that scene where I think it was Melvin or somebody was telling you about just how hard it was to exist in like the day-to-day. Like, you get up at different times and people are coming in and out and there's drugs, and you can just, the way he presented it, you did feel this exhaustion, and you thought, oh, that's what she wanted to get out of, and that gave you a really it connected you to her. And I think that's what your work does. And you can imagine how hard it would be in those circumstances. And I think it's really important. But it's what you were talking about, though, that, what they were doing in their years that then connect these two women. And I remember I texted my producers and I was like, I'm getting Romeo and Juliet vibes from this. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about how what you thought were two very disparate stories actually have like this really violent connection? It was really random. And I think that, like, part of it is we're not from there, like I'm not Dene. I'd never been to the Navajo Nation before this. Like, I'm Cree from Saskatchewan, and I've lived in Ontario for many years. But so when we went there and people were telling us about, that you can get away with murder, and that we went on a search somewhere, and this guy just drives by in his truck and he was like, oh, there was a body there and there was a body there and there was this happened over here. And you just kind of feel like you're like, is this real? Like, is this actually true?
Yeah.
And
I think that because we were not from this community, and I've seen so many other examples of like people coming to communities where they're not from and not having, taken care, the kind of harm that can come from that kind of storytelling, if you're, further reinforcing stereotypes about communities. And so we were really, really, really wary of doing that. But then when we started actually getting deeper and making these connections, it was really shocking, because we chose these two women's cases just kind of almost randomly, and we did not know that there was a connection between them initially. And even when we kind of first got the inkling, because Ella May lived in Sweetwater her whole life, and 20 years before she went missing, her husband was killed. And it was, again, kind of a seemingly random encounter. They lived near, kind of at the base of the Carrizo Mountains, near the Four Corners area in the United States. And he was going up the mountain, or they had a farm, but he was going to get water as well, because they didn't have running water.
In his truck.
Yeah, he was in his truck, and he was going, and there was just a chance encounter with another family that had spent the day up on the mountain, and they were coming down. And because it was this narrow mountain pass, I guess they encountered each other, and there was a near collision, but it didn't happen. But I guess, tensions and everything escalated. So that there was an argument, and then the other people in the other truck started chasing him, and he tried to get away from them in his vehicle, and he couldn't, and eventually he tried to take refuge at his sister's house. But the other people were also living in Sweetwater, and so they beat Benjamin Begay and killed him. And that happened, as I said, 20 years before Ella May went missing. And as we started looking into Ella May's disappearance, we heard about her husband Benjamin's death. And then we also heard about another deadly retaliation that then happened years later. Their grandchildren, essentially, one of their grandkids, and then
one of Ella May's grandkids.
Ella May's grandkids,
yeah,
retaliated against the Wagons and beat their grandfather, and he died. That level of violence that across generations was just so shocking. And what we discover in the podcast is that one of those young men was Christina Creo's son. Yeah.
And his name was Evan.
Evan Begay.
Evan Begay. And so is there suspicion that Evan Begay is associated with Ella May's disappearance?
No, there's not. And actually one of the young men that we talked to from the Wagon family said that when Ella May went missing, people immediately did look at him. He said the police actually came to talk to him because of, this bad blood between these two families, and the fact that they, despite all of that, they remained neighbors in this tiny community of Sweetwater. But no, Ella May's disappearance, someone has been arrested and is actually going on trial next month, and was a stranger to the community, had only been in Sweetwater for a couple of weeks, and was connected to Ella May kind of randomly. Ella May's sister is dating his dad. So this Preston Toth, who's been charged with carjacking causing serious bodily injury and assault causing serious bodily injury in Ella May's disappearance, just came to Sweetwater a couple of weeks before Ella May went missing. And
it was a robbery.
Yeah, I think police allege that he accused him of stealing her truck, and it's so much of it is still unclear, honestly. But in interviews with investigators, FBI and criminal investigators from the Navajo Nation, he admitted to leaving Ella May's house that night in her truck with her, and to assaulting her, and to he said he snapped and maybe hit her harder than he thought, and that she was bleeding and probably dead when he left her on the side of the road somewhere in Sweetwater. But later, when police took him back out to Sweetwater to try to help them find Ella May, they didn't find her, and they said in documents that we read that they didn't believe that he was telling the truth about where he had actually left Ella May. So that trial is happening next month in Arizona. So I'm sure there's going to be more information coming about that. But Preston's pleaded not guilty.
But there hasn't been murder charges. Is it because they can't find her?
This is the first time I think in Navajo Nation history, according to one of the criminal investigators that we talked to, that they have ever had this level of charges without a body. But LMA has still not been found.
And what about Christina? Do we know there are suspects in her murder? Do we have any idea of what happened to her?
They don't even know that it's a murder. There's basically also what we kind of unpack a lot of in the podcast is just kind of the levels of policing. So, there are the patrol officers who initially respond to missing persons calls. And if there's an immediate sign that there's been a major crime that has occurred, like eventually with LMA, they realized, I think, very quickly on that they were investigating a homicide. Then it triggers another set of Navajo police, the criminal investigators, to take over the case because the federal government essentially has responsibility for public safety on reservations. They work with the FBI on major crimes. And so that happened immediately with LMA, but that's never happened for Christina. Her case was with this patrol officer that we spend a lot of time with as well, who knew her and cared about her and, did investigate, but who told us there were threats made to him and that he was worried and kind of afraid to investigate Christina's case. And because there was no evidence of a major crime, despite the fact that, a skull was found not far from where she was missing, that her case was never escalated to a criminal. Well, we asked criminal investigators, and at one point they said, "Oh yeah, we are looking into it." And then the next time we asked the same person, he didn't know who she was or what her case was. And then we asked again a third time, and they said, "We can't comment on it."
It all kind of seems to be going to the sort of lack of respect that they have. And I know you mentioned in the podcast that there's people say, it's commonly said that you can get away with murder on the Navajo Nation. So can you give me a bit more of an understanding of what is going on there? Why are things kind of so piecemeal or haphazard, or I don't know what word you want to use?
The answer is so complex, really. But I think that at least initially what we saw was that a lot of the issues start, at least when it comes to crime and solving crime, with the lack of resources of Navajo police. So when we were out on the ride-along, we were patrolling an area, I think they said the size of Connecticut. It was large. You could be. We drove for 45 minutes to respond to one call, but you could then be called somewhere an hour and a half away, and that's still in the same jurisdiction. I think there were 3 officers on duty that night, and it was call after call after call. And you think how can police not show up or not respond? But then very quickly I got it. I'm because they're out there alone. They are driving long distances. They don't have enough officers. We spent some time in the dispatch as well, and it didn't actually make it into the podcast, but it was just this Shiprock Police, how can I help you? Shiprock Police, how can I help you? Shiprock Police, how can I help you? And one dispatcher trying to I'll let the sergeant know, but they have 3 officers on duty tonight, so they just
and
can't.
you're number 10 or 15 on our list.
And they're triaging they're oh my gosh, this is happening urgently. We need to send 2 people out to this thing right now. So we actually only have one other officer to respond to. There were so many calls that came in that, you're just how can you actually respond to this? And I feel that is something that affects obviously the urgent calls that are happening on that shift. But I think that what we also heard from people was that they were worried about retaliation within their communities, and they knew that police couldn't protect them. So they were, doing things like taking matters into their own hands, or not calling the police, or not coming forward if they knew or had information, because they're more worried about what their neighbor is going to do, because it's going to take police however many hours, even if they do respond. But then the other part of it is that, there's this really, if it's a major crime like murder or arson or, sexual assault, then it gets bumped up to a criminal investigator and an FBI. But the declination rates for major crime are are so high. We read a report that said it was like 30% essentially, but we know it's much higher than that actually, because there are many different levels in which crimes can be declined to be prosecuted. Like, so if eventually, if it's a major crime on the Navajo Nation, it'll be investigated by a criminal investigator and an FBI agent, and then they will go to a district attorney, a federal prosecutor, and say, this is what I have, and they'll either say, we'll prosecute that or we won't, but often they say they won't because they don't have enough evidence. But even before that, sometimes FBI agents can decline to even investigate things. And if they don't, there is a tribal court and there is a tribal court system and things can go through there, but every crime, even if it's murder, is treated as a misdemeanor in tribal court, and the maximum sentence that you can impose in tribal court is 1 year.
Why?
That is part of I think the Major Crimes Act and the law that they can't impose more in tribal court.
Tell us a little bit about the Major Crimes Act, because it's really interesting. I mean, it sounds policy-ish, but you actually get into it, and it is a really interesting way that things are divided. And
yeah.
It talks a lot about the history of Indigenous people in the United States.
Yeah, I wish my producer Anya was here, because I feel like she could write a book now about the Major Crimes Act. Like, she just did such incredible research in helping to understand that. But essentially, the law that dictates how crime is handled on a reservation goes back to the Major Crimes Act. And this one single crime that happened in 1881 in, I think, what's now North Dakota or South Dakota, where a chief named Crow Dog killed another chief named Spotted Tail. And because it happened on the reservation, the tribe was handling it the way that they do. And I think that they had asked Crow Dog to pay some kind of restitution to Spotted Tail's family. But when U.S. authorities got word of it, they weren't happy with that. And they tried Crow Dog for the first time. They kind of waded into crime and justice in Indian country, and they tried him for murder, and he was found guilty and ordered to be hanged. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the justices sided with Crow Dog and said, okay, the U.S. authorities are overstepping their jurisdiction here, that, they upheld the tribe's sovereignty to decide what happened. And then very quickly after that, Congress passed the Major Crimes Act. And it dictates basically the federal jurisdiction over major crimes on the reservation. And so it's why there are FBI agents assigned to the Navajo Nation. It's why all of those crimes happen in federal court. But then, of course, I think they said there were 12 FBI agents assigned to the Navajo Nation, which is, again, this huge community, and the rates of crime are staggering. And that they're often, newer agents who aren't from the community, and I think there's a lot of issues with having that oversight and not having, the criminal investigators who are from the community, who have experience there, who live there, have more power and control over those investigations and those prosecutions. And I think that's something that's so it's very complex. Mm-hmm. It's like, these are very, very serious issues. It's like life and death and justice for families that are already dealing with so much. And this is just one system within this community,
within a country.
Yeah. But even I just mean we're so focused on crime and justice, but everywhere, mm-hmm. Every person we met, we were like, LMA lives without running water and electricity. Mm-hmm. It's like, how, where are the there were power lines not far from her house, but they never came to her place. Christina, I think struggled with so much, but there's the lack of kind of social supports for people. There's no any kind of addiction or rehab treatment centers on the reservation. There's all this exploitation that was happening concurrently while we were there investigating. People were getting kidnapped off the streets and taken to these rehab homes in Phoenix as part of this Medicare scam. They were, getting money from the federal government to provide rehab for people with addictions, and really not offering any medical support. And some people died in these places these places that just popped up in homes, like in the outskirts of
What's your
Phoenix.
next
It was happening while we were there, and we were really just like, there was just so much. It's so overwhelming.
It's overwhelming. But can we talk a little bit now about, like, you're in the United States, but you really were at the forefront here in Canada and at the CBC when you were here, bringing sort of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, but also issues with Indigenous people in Canada. And I guess one of the things, like, Canadians, at least those engaged in the world, understand that this is happening here in Canada. We've heard a lot less about what's happening in the States. Maybe some people had the assumption that assimilation was different. Maybe the reserve system was different. I don't know. But from your experience, from your place, when you're in two different countries, but where are the similarities? Where are the differences? Like, can you kind of give me a bit of a bigger picture about what's happening with those communities in here versus there?
I feel like it's very similar.
Yeah.
I think we have this shared experience across, like, Canada and across the United States of colonization, of surviving, attempted genocide. I think that the impacts of that are, thought to be things that happened in the 1800s or early 1900s. But I think that part of what our work is trying to do is show how that's continuing to impact communities. Like, it's not something that happened, 50, 60 years ago that it isn't an issue anymore. It's like these are still underreported stories. I feel grateful that I've been able to do this work, but it also feels like I'm not extraordinary in any way. Like, every community, every family has a story like this. We've all been impacted by, whether you're in Canada, or the United States, like, by these shared experiences of really what was like I said, attempted genocide, forced assimilation, impacts of Indian residential schools here in Canada, boarding schools in the United States have all contributed to these ongoing crises of violence against not just Indigenous women and girls, but men and boys as well. And so I think that, there are obviously differences. It's like incredibly diverse nations across both Canada and the U.S., but I think there are so many shared experiences. And I think that something that, that we're trying to do with the podcast is really just help amplify voices and stories of these people in these communities, these extraordinary people who are pushing for change, are pushing for something different. Like Seraphine, and her advocacy for her aunt, Denise Carrillo, and her advocacy for her sister. Like, Bernadine Biel, who runs this, like, volunteer search and rescue group and is busy every weekend helping Navajo families. And she finds people, like, her and her dogs find people. It's like, it's kind of amazing just what's happening on the ground. And I think what we're just trying to do is shine, like, the light that we have, so that people can be aware. But that also, I hope at least, like, our goal is also to create that space for empathy, like to use the power of storytelling to let people, like, connect with one another and realize, like, you might not think you care about Indigenous communities or Indigenous history in this country, in the land that's ours that you live on, but here's why you should,
Are there not enough American Indigenous journalists? Because is it unfair to, like, it feels like, why is a Canadian Indigenous journalist the one telling the stories? And I know you did, like, you have a history of moving down to the States and working for Spotify, but I also feel like it feels like you're again being a trailblazer where are the other storytellers that should be the ones telling these stories as well?
Well, they're there. I mean, for sure, they should absolutely be amplified and supported, and absolutely, like, same in Canada, right? Like, there should be more Indigenous podcasts and more Indigenous journalists and more, like, Indigenous people helping to tell these stories. I think it was, like, what's happened really interestingly, I think, in the U.S. in the last couple of years is, like, and I obviously work in journalism, but I feel like this is applicable to, just storytelling in general. And, like, you have somebody like Sterling Harjo who creates in this show Reservation Dogs that is just incredible and very much like a strong Indigenous person leading this whole crew of Indigenous people to tell our own stories for ourselves, which is kind of the first time that's happened. But then you have like a movie like Killers of the Flower Moon at the Oscars, which is very much non-Indigenous people in like having the agency to tell these stories. And I think that there's like absolutely like, you know, benefits to everybody raising awareness and raising voices. But, you know, I hope that we should be doing everything we can to help support other Indigenous people to get to do this work, for sure.
Speaking of the ability, I mean, we all know, and it's sad, but your time at Spotify is over.
Yeah.
How are you feeling about like that? Are you feeling like you'll be able to continue to tell these stories, just maybe with a different group, or like what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I feel sad, really. Like, I feel like we've been able to, like, sad that this chapter's ending, because I feel like, you know, we've done 3 seasons of Stolen, and I feel like we really kind of took advantage and did as much as we could, and did some really ambitious storytelling and reporting, which I'm so proud of. But also I know there's more to do. There's more, like, you know, I'm absolutely committed to continuing this work in some way. What that looks like is unclear. I don't really know. Like the whole industry feels like it's really kind of imploded in the last year, and like the kind of story that we tell, which is like investigative and narrative and told over 8 episodes, like,
that takes a long time.
Yeah. And I just feel like there's not as much investment in that right now. There's not as much of, there's not as many opportunities to do that kind of work. So I don't know. I hope we'll be able to continue. We'd love to find a new home for Stolen, but it also feels like, you know, we're at a bit of a crossroads, and we'll have to see. I mean, I think, like, I feel like I'm committed to doing this work in some way, shape, or form. And so much of my overall career has been about adapting to whatever the next thing is, and so I'll keep doing that. But I think podcasting is really kind of the perfect medium for these stories, because of everything we've been talking about for the last, you know, hour. Like, just, you know, the ability to kind of dive deeply and to really kind of try to like place people with you in the world that you're in, and get this 360 view and get to know people, and it feels like
I think it's one of the few mediums that allows you to actually connect on a human level in a way that others just don't. It's just so strong in that capacity. And I think that if there's been any advances here in Canada in terms of that understanding, it's because of the work you do. It really is. Like, I just think that has just brought so much to the forefront, to have people listen to it who care to listen. I really do. I think that your work is so important. And ironically, it shows in the year that you've had. It's an incredible year. Your last podcast was really about your father and the experiences, and it was so personal. And this one was personal because it was human nature and human beings and other Indigenous women. Did it feel different for you to approach it? Like, tell me a little bit about that, because it really was such a different story for you.
And that was deliberate, honestly, like, because Surviving St. Michael's was such a deeply personal story. Like, I absolutely did not want to do something personal again right away. Like, I think I'm still honestly just kind of processing everything. And I think that maybe people have an idea that I know more than I do or have. Like, I feel like this last, like, you know, the last, I guess, 5 seasons of the podcast have been such an education for me as well. Like, you know, I didn't know this history. I didn't learn it in school. Like, I have lived experiences, so I knew part of it, and I think that really helped me tell these stories in important ways. But this has all been such an education for me as well. And so I think that, you know, it's been a lot. It's been a lot to do, for sure. So we really wanted to not have a personal story for the season 3. But that presented its own challenges too. Like, I think it was also really hard to not be from the community, and there's so much, I think, we had so much anxiety, and we tried to be so careful about reporting on another community.
Because you're dropping in somewhere.
Totally. And we went on 5 reporting trips. Like, that's a lot, but it's not a lot.
You're not living there.
No. Yeah. And so, like, you know, we worked with a Dene journalist who was kind of like our sensitivity reader / listener, who's actually from, like, the Carrizo Mountains area and still lives there. So I mean that's like something we can do, but I feel like there was just so much effort put into wanting to fairly represent this place because we're not from there. I feel like I'm really drawn to stories that I am part of, though, as well. Like I feel like I'll probably return to that in some way. Like I feel like that's what really kind of sparks my curiosity, and I think I still have more learning to do and more understanding to do, and this is kind of my way of doing that.
Well, I was going to actually have the last question be from a quote from you that sort of ties to that, where it says, this is from you, we're all talking about reconciliation and what it means to reconcile, but we don't even understand the truth yet. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I've learned, honestly. Through surviving St. Michael's, that's what I learned. I was like, what? Like, how can we be post-truth? It's impossible that we could be post-truth. And it can be, I think it was 2022 when we did that podcast, and we just uncovered like the history of this one school, and not even the history of it, like a sliver of the history of this one school, and that hasn't happened for like the 100 schools that were in Canada, however many were in the United States. It's kind of still shocking to me, and it's the thing that I feel like so proud of that podcast and so proud of what we were able to do, and like so personally grateful to have had that experience, like as an intergenerational survivor, and to get to know more about my own family and my own history. But I think it's really shameful that we don't know more and that we aren't like stopping everything right now to make that happen. And I'm going to try to take some time off and, relax a bit. But I think I'll be trying to think about the things that feel that urgent to me, and that like the work that I'm connected to, that I'm so passionate about, that is still ongoing here. Like,
oh, I can't wait to hear what you do next. And congrats on all of the success. It's really so exciting to sit back and see. And your work's amazing. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's so nice to get to talk about this with such a thoughtful listener, and because once the podcast is out, like the infrastructure to be as invested in it kind of just disappears.
I know, it's
and
a
then
weird
you're
feeling,
like, it's so weird. But then you're like, oh my God, someone's interested. I want to talk to you about it. Can we talk for a couple hours? Great.
Yeah, we keep going. Thanks, Connie.
Thank you.